It is I, your instructor once again, John Harvey, broadcasting to you, this time from my office, the really cool one. Unfortunately, you can't see it because I'm using a screen capture video program and not a camera. So, I just wanted to show you, before I left that topic completely, here is what's on the web page to show you how number 54 works. In the list of study questions for 52, 53, and 54, it includes a link that goes straight to, here's a perfect answer. So, I know it was kind of cramped and stuff on what I did in Melanie's office on that tiny board, but in case you want to see the real answer, this is what it looks like for when you're practicing for the big day. And I will now be signing off before, you won't even notice, because I'll be like signing off, then it'll probably take me 10 minutes, but to you it'll be like no time at all, because I'll then, sort of splice it together. This is probably too technical for you. It is I, John Harvey, once again, here returning to you from the bunker. And first I wanted to show you 52, 53, and 54, where in the study questions it also has right above them the links to the exact right answers in case you need to want to look at that while you're practicing. Okay, let's move on now to 55. Okay, 55 I already did. I was telling you at the end of the other video, at the one where I showed 54, I talked to you about the fact that in this model, expectations are going to be determining the outcome. Now let me do 56. List and explain the 5 stages of decision making. And let me jump over here. Here they are. I mean, you're going to find them easy enough in the book. That's not the full answer because you have to have the explanation of each one. But I want to give you some background so you can understand better what it's talking about. And the idea here is, how do people decide, in our case, currency market participants decide, say, for example, what currency to buy and how much and so forth. So the first thing you do, and I got this from various psychological sources in the psychological literature, first thing you do is you think to yourself, what could possibly happen in the future? Like, let's say you're talking about betting on the Cowboy. Who do they play next? The Eagles? I can't remember. The Cowboy game, all right? Eventuality analysis. Well, the Cowboys could win or the Cowboys could lose. Or you could be more specific about this. Such and such receiver could be, covered well by their cornerback or not, or so on. So you're thinking to yourself, what are the possible future states of the world, all right? So what sort of things could happen in the future? If we're talking currency markets, what might happen with Brexit? What might be going on with in Germany with Merkel and the decisions on immigrants, how this might affect the German economy and the German financial markets and so forth. All the sorts of things you could think about. Imagine that as a currency dealer, what could possibly happen in the future, all right? Second, well, given what could happen, what are my choices available to me? What are the things I could do? And what would the consequence of each one of those choices be in those potential futures? For example, what if I thought to myself, well, one of the possibilities is that Brexit could entirely destroy the British economy. Britain could catch on fire, burn, and sink into the ocean. I could buy pounds. What would the consequence of my choice of buying pounds be? I would become very poor because my pounds wouldn't be worth anything because Britain doesn't exist anymore. So up in number 1, you've thought about the various possibilities. In number 2, you're thinking, well, okay, what choices are available to me? I can buy pounds, I can buy euros, I can buy yen, and of course it can get much more complicated than that in terms of quantities and how long and whether we're buying options or futures or forward or whatever. But what it boils down to is, do I want to hold pounds or do I want to hold dollars, all right? So that's my choice. And then you're thinking through, okay, if I make this choice and outcome A, which I figured out up in number 1, occurs, what would the consequence be? So you're sort of matching every one of your choices in number 2 with one of the possibilities that could happen in the future in number 1, and then determining what's the consequence of that. How would that work out for me? Now, in number 3, you're kind of weighting all those different possibilities. For example, let's say you think there's a 90% chance that the pound will recover. And so what you end up doing is you think, well, 90%, that's pretty confident. I'm going to weight that pretty high. And let something else be 10%, well, that also offers a lot of profit, but I don't think it's very likely, so I'm going to lower the weight on that. So this decision weight assignment is kind of, in looking at all my choices, I'm ranking how likely I think each one is. It's not quite that. I really need to show you on the board, but that's the basic idea. I'll show you on Tuesday. But the idea, again, is You're ranking all these choices to decide which one looks like the best idea, all right? Now, once you've figured out which one looks like the best idea in number 3, step 4 is actually pretty easy, all right? Now, there are circumstances in which what you figured out in 3 can actually be very complicated, and step 4 can be complicated, therefore, as well, but typically it's not. Typically, you go through and you think to yourself, well, geez, it looks like to me the most likely outcome of all the things that can happen in the world right now is the pound's going to recover. I'm going to buy some pounds, all right? So, when I get down to number 4, I'm going to buy some pounds. And then, let's say you've bought these pounds, you've held on to them for the 6 months or 3 months or whatever it was you thought these events would take would transpire over, and now you're looking back on it. That's what number 5 is. You're thinking to yourself, well, did that work out well or not? Was that a good idea? Because in part 5, then you're supposed to be sort of adjusting the way you make forecasts. Well, and go back to gambling. You lost all kinds of money on the first 3 games of the season. Now you're thinking, what did I do wrong? Where was it that I overemphasized something? Where was it that I underemphasized something? Post-event assessment of your forecast. As it turns out, in real life, people rarely do number 5. Part of it is they're so dang busy continuing to do 1, 2, 3, and 4 that they never really stop and do number 5. Another is that even in situations where it's going to cost you a lot of money, like for example with the currency dealing, people don't collect the data in a way that makes it easy to look at your choices post-event. But that's the general idea. Oh, let me tell you one more thing about that. It's kind of interesting. People tend to remember their choices in a better light than they really were. There was a study done by Kahneman and Tversky, 2 very famous psychologists, and they were teaching in Israel at the time, and they asked a bunch of Israeli college students, what do you think is going to happen at the upcoming, what do you call those things, summit in Moscow about allowing Jews to emigrate from Soviet Russia? Because they wanted the heck out of Soviet Russia. There was the same, I don't want to say same sort of discrimination as there was in Nazi Germany, because that was a lot worse, but they wanted to leave, and they wanted to go to Israel. And so the question was, they were going to have a big discussion about this in Moscow. And so they asked these Israeli college students, who presumably would have a big interest in the outcome and pay some attention to what was happening, what do you think will happen? All right? And let's say the summit was going to be a month later. What do you think will happen? All right, so the summit happened a month later, and then they asked all the students back again 6 months later. And they asked them, how well did you forecast? And they were heavily biased towards thinking, I did a great job. I knew exactly what was going to happen. And then they'd pull out the sheet of paper. Well, actually, this is what you said. Oh yeah, I guess so. So the post-event assessment thing, interestingly, typically isn't done because you're too busy with 1 through 4. You don't really collect data in a way that makes it easier to do post-event assessment, and you tend to remember your decisions in a more positive light than was really true. Okay, now, in forming these forecasts and making these decisions, psychologists say, and I'm going to slide up here a little bit, psychologists say that people rely on 3 heuristics, all right, 3 rules of thumb. And these are all laid out in the book. You can easily write them out. I want to tell you something about what I have written here in just a second, but availability, representativeness, and anchoring are the big 3 according to Kahneman and Tversky. These are methods of doing forecasts and making decisions. Now, before I go any further, let me tell you that the definitions in the book, I decided some time ago, I made them too technical. I pretty much took them straight from the way Kahneman and Tversky said them, so I don't think it was clear enough. So I wrote these up as being more user-friendly definitions. So these don't appear in the book. These don't appear anywhere but right here on your screen right now. So take a moment to jot them down. And while normally I would be writing them along with you, which would time this out very well so that we would all be done about the same time, I've already got it typed up there. So I'm going to run in the kitchen real quick and start the kettle for a cup of tea. I'll be right back. Right. just like Douglas MacArthur, I have returned. Which is interesting, because right behind me right now is a big poster from a conference at the Nimitz Museum down in Fredericksburg about the Pacific War, and it's signed by all. They have these seminars down there, and they'll have people who are really in the battle come and talk. And this particular poster is signed by the participants, some Japanese, sailors, as well as Allied prisoners and Allied soldiers. And it's supposed to have been like $250. The writing is slightly smudged. You can't even tell where somebody had signed. Melanie picked it up for me for $50. And you know how I feel about good deals like Goodwill. This was a great deal. So she paid far more to have it framed for me for my birthday than she did for the actual item. All right, well, returning to our story here, I hope you've had time to write everything down. These are the 3 heuristics, really big deal in psychology. And the idea is that people make decisions by rules of thumb. Let me give you an idea. You ever heard somebody say, I judge a man by his shoes? That's a rule of thumb. Or maybe there are instructors who judge students by where they sit in class. I don't, because I always sat in the back, so I figure the people in the back are the really smart people. Oh my God, I do judge people by that. But I know some instructors judge students by where they sit in class, and they assume those in the back are going to be paying attention, and on average, those in the front will be. All right, that's a rule of thumb. So these 3 things here are rules of thumb. Let me start with availability, and you can read this as well as I can. It's used to decide how often you think something happened in the past, or how likely it is in the future. So this is used for determining, what it says right there. In general, the easier it is to imagine, the more often you think it happened, or the more likely you think it's going to happen. For example, snow, let's say in Texas, at TCU near final exam time. All right. Now, people are generally going to just sort of like, well, how easy is it for me to picture that? I mean, has that happened of late? I can't remember anymore. I've been here for 30 years. I don't remember. I know it has happened before, but we've actually had to. This was must have been right before I turned 40. We had snow during finals. They had to cancel a day of finals. And you had to give the students in those courses what grade they had up to that point, but they had the option to take a final on a Saturday the next semester, which turned out to be the Saturday of my 40th birthday, so I was giving final exams. Isn't that a sad story? So, how likely is it to snow here in Texas in December? Well, I don't necessarily go to these tables to look these things up. How easy is it to imagine? What about October? Geez, I can't even begin to imagine that. So that must not be very likely, all right? Nor do I think it happened very often in the past. What about in February or January? Well, actually, I can kind of picture that. I mean, it won't be for a long period of time, but we may have an ice storm or something like that. So availability depends on how easy it is to picture something, how easily it comes to mind, all right? And the more easily it comes to mind, the more you think it's likely to happen. And actually, that's not a bad rule. On average, that's a pretty good idea. Let's see, how likely is it that TCU will have a winning season? Oh my Lord, football. If you asked me that 20 years ago, I would be crying right now. It would be so sad. But now it's like, oh yeah, sure. The real question is whether or not, how good a bowl game we'll get to go to, not whether or not we'll have a winning season. So it's not a bad rule on average, but it's easily biased. And I'll get to that in just a moment. Representativeness. This is a little bit more complicated, but break it down. All right. It's used when you're trying to decide what process caused a certain outcome or what outcome a process will cause. Let's see. Let's say we're talking about flipping a coin, all right? Tossing a coin being the process, and whether it's a head or a tail being the outcome, all right? So that's what we're talking about here. A process is like tossing a coin, and an outcome is like heads or tails. Or if we're talking currency market, a process is, let's say, the Fed trying to figure out whether they're going to raise interest rates or lower them, and then the impact on the currency market. The outcome is either the dollar appreciated or the dollar depreciated, something like that. Now, oftentimes, you only have one or the other. You either have the process, but you don't have the outcome yet, or you have the outcome, but you're trying to figure out what caused it, all right? So that's what this is talking about. It's talking about when you only have one half of the equation. I only know what happened. Like, let's say you were told the outcome of the 10 tosses of a coin, all right? And you're trying to figure out what kind of a coin it was, and in particular, whether it was fairly weighted. And if you had 5 heads and 5 tails, you'd be like, well, I'm fairly confident that was a fairly weighted coin. If you had 6 of one and 4 of the other, it's probably fairly weighted. 7 and 3, 10 and 0, I think that's probably an unfairly weighted coin. All right, so the process that created 10 heads and 0 tails was an unfairly weighted coin being tossed 10 times. All right, so that's the kind of thing we're talking about here. Now, as far as having the process first, so that was having the outcome first. I know how many heads and tails there were. I'm trying to figure out what process caused it. If you can have the process first. You can say, okay, I'm going to toss a coin 100 times. What do you think I'm going to get? All right. So there you have the process. You know what it is, and you're trying to estimate the outcome. Here's what people do. They expect the outcome to very closely resemble the process in the sense that the coin example, people tend to expect something very close to 50-50. Now, on average, that's a good rule. That's not a stupid thing to do. Obviously, the 10 heads and 0 tails, that's very likely not a fairly weighted coin. 5 and 5, that probably is, all right? But when you end up with, say, 7 and 3 or 8 and 2, it's a little harder to say. But in general, the rule is a good rule, except that, and we'll get to this later, except that people tend to make the outcome match too closely to the process. In other words, they don't tolerate very much variation from 50-50. Obviously, 60-40 is very possible. Or let's just do 10 tosses. 6-4, is that possible? Oh my Lord, yes. But people underestimate how likely that is to happen. They expect the outcome to too closely represent the process. In general, a good rule, but people tend to too closely expect the process to match the outcome. Now, last one, anchoring. This one is really weird, okay? Because with anchoring, it says that, well, let me give you what the big experiment that they did. They had somebody walk into a room and, okay, sit down in that chair. And then in front of, then they asked him a question. What percentage of countries in Africa are members of the United Nations? Wait, don't answer yet. Then they spin this wheel of fortune that has numbers from 0 to 100. And they wait for it to stop. Tick, 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 tick. Stops at 33. Okay, plus or minus 33. Now that should have nothing to do with it. In fact, they saw that it was totally random, all right? But people anchor to it. Statistically, significantly, they anchor to whatever number comes up. That, as it says here in the second sentence, psychologists have discovered that people tend to anchor very firmly to initial values regardless of how they were generated. Now, on the one hand, they say like on an exam when you can't decide which way you should go with the answer, well, go with your first instinct. Well, on the one hand, that might not be a bad rule. But once again, as it is an approximation, it can tend to cause problems. For example, you can cause people to lock onto a value even though it had nothing to do with how the forecast should be formed. So a really weird one. Now, we're going to use all 3 of these plus some other psychological factors in explaining how the currency market works, the behavior of currency dealers, and why we might have overreaction to various pieces of information and bandwagon effects where the currency market keeps moving in a particular direction even though everyone thinks, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would it keep going that direction? But that's not until later. Let's jump over to 58. I'm going to try to do 58 and 59 here, and then we'll stop. Okay, 58. What are the forecast construction biases introduced by the 3 heuristics? And I already started talking about them. It's in the book. It's easy to find. But let me tell you about availability. With availability, remember, the idea is that you believe that an event is more likely or happened more often in the past if it's easier to picture. Here's the problem. There are things that make stuff easier to picture that have nothing to do with how likely they are. Especially, for example, if they were very dramatic. All right, something that's very dramatic really sticks out in your mind and is easy to recall. Therefore, it seems more probable than it really is. Likewise, things that were more recent. If it's rained, or let's say if it's had an ice storm during finals week once in the last 10 years, but it was last year, well, then obviously it's going to end up being more likely in your mind than if it was 10 years ago, even if you were not 8 years old 10 years ago like you might have been. And then the last thing is, if something fits your preconceptions, you're more likely to notice it. You're more likely to think that it's likely to happen. I'm trying to think here of a example that doesn't have to do with football. But if you think that, okay, here's an example. I have heard Tennessee fans describe Notre Dame fans for several years, some years back. Tennessee and Notre Dame played, against each other for about 4 years in a row. And the Tennessee fans said the Notre Dame fans were the nicest people in the world. They were very, very pleasant, very welcoming. And so you are now going to walk into that parking lot with all the, with all the people, what do you call it, tailgating and so forth. And even if someone's trying to be sort of a jerk, you kind of interpret it differently, right? Because your impression is, your preconception is that Notre Dame fans are nice, all right? Which I went to 12 years of Catholic school. I'm really sick of Notre Dame, but that does not enter into this at all. Okay, representativeness. Now, I already told you this one too. And the sort of general rule is that people expect causation where chance may be dominant, all right? The idea being that let's say you tossed the coin, or somebody told you they tossed a coin 10 times and they had 7 heads and 3 tails. People have a tendency to believe that's representative of an unfairly weighted coin. That they expect the process to be something that specifically creates 7 and 3, heads and tails. They have a tendency to not expect very much variation whatsoever from the process. Another way of wording it is, people tend to ignore very simple and presumably intuitive statistical rules of statistical inference. There's a very famous literature where, and this feels wrong, but listen to this. Very famous literature where statisticians looked at basketball players who and whether or not they had a hot hand. In other words, this person, they can't miss. Their incredible scoring, percentage. Not what do you call it, John? Field goal percentage every night. This person's on fire. Well, statisticians will say, yeah, that's just as easily explained by sheer chance. That, sometimes you're going to have 3 good nights in a row. And it really was nothing but sheer chance. Now, maybe there is a causal factor deep down there, but you can easily explain it with sheer chance. Think about this. What if you tossed a coin 100 times? Do you not think let's make it 1,000 times. Do you not think at some point you might throw 7 heads in a row? You might. But would you say, oh my Lord, that coin is on fire. That coin can't miss. Look at that. What an incredible coin. No, you would say, no, it's sheer chance. That just happens. Statisticians say that's what tends to happen when you have a baseball player with a hitting streak, when you have a basketball player with a hot hand, as they say, which sounds wrong. It rubs against the sort of deep representativeness that's inside of all of us that wants to have an explanation. Oh, another example. Let's see. Does this work for this one? Yes. All right. Kahneman Tversky did a study of Israeli Air Force pilots and their training. And what they discovered was that whenever a pilot had a really good landing, the trainers would praise them, and the next landing wouldn't be as good. Meanwhile, if they had a really lousy landing, then the trainers would yell at them, and they would have a better landing next time. And so what the trainers had deduced was, they figured, I must be having an impact on this. I should never praise my students, and I should always yell at them. Because the praise, next time they didn't do as well. But with the yelling at them, next time they did much better. Well, Kahneman Tversky said, you know what, if you break this down, it was just sheer chance. Sometimes you have a really, really good landing. And odds are the next one's just not going to be as good. It's kind of like when Michael Jordan would score 60 points in a night. Next night, when he scored 40 points, did Phil Jackson, the coach of the Bulls, blame himself? Oh, Lord, I should never have said that Jordan did so well last night because I caused him not to do as well tonight. Jordan's not going to score 60 points every night. That's on the outside edge of that distribution of possibilities. And so we tend to think, however, that there's an actual cause and not necessarily chance. All right, so that's their representatives. Anchoring. Gosh, the definition itself is pretty much the actual problem. People put undue weight on the first estimate. They rarely adjust very much from the first estimate, regardless of what new information comes in. All right, so let me go to 59. That'll be the last one we do here. Let's see, switch over to that. Okay, 59. Explain why people prefer to follow conventional wisdom. Ooh, this is really neat. Okay. I was at a dinner at the Chancellor's once because he's always asking me over and asking me different stuff. Actually, that wasn't it. I had served on a committee that helped pick the new business school dean, so he had everybody over for dinner that had been on that committee. And I ended up at a table with some MBA students. And one of them, his wife, was in a football pool at work. And this is how they were choosing which team. All you had to do was pick the winner in the NFL game straight up. And this is how she and her girlfriend were picking the winner. Let's say that the Lions were playing the Bears. They would imagine if a lion fought a bear, who would win? All right? They were in first place. Okay. Now, let's say that meanwhile, you're doing tons of statistical analysis, but you're getting beat. It's not working out. You're not coming up with the same answers. You would say, the people, the MBA student's wife and her friend were just lucky, all right? They're getting the right answer time after time after time, but they're not getting any credit for it. We're deciding they're just lucky. Meanwhile, if you're doing it the right way, if you're doing it the logical way, even when you don't come up with the right answer, we still say, well, you got unlucky. I mean, who could have known? I mean, you were doing it the right way. Well, Keynes and psychologists talk about this. They say that it's always better to follow conventional wisdom. If everyone else is saying that the Patriots are going to win the Super Bowl, then, or I'm sorry, let me do an exchange rate example. No. Let me go to the financial crisis. Everyone is saying you should be buying subprime derivatives, all right? And you're a fund manager, and your customers want you to be buying them, your boss wants you to be buying, but you think it's a bad idea. You think that it's going to collapse. You know what? You're more likely to keep your job if you just go on buying the subprime derivatives. Because if you buy them and they appreciate, then you're a genius. Well, not a genius. You've just done the rational thing. If you buy them and the market collapses, well, good Lord, who could have known that? We're not going to blame you for that. Who on earth could have known? But think about the risk you take in going against everybody else. I know everyone else thinks this is a good idea, but I don't. Well, you better be right. Because if you're not right, then you have really screwed up. And frankly, even if you're right, in that case, people might say, well, you just got lucky. So you're not going to get any credit for it. So you're much safer following conventional logic. You're much more likely to keep your job. When your mom said, if everyone else is doing it, does that mean you should too? Apparently the answer is yes. All right, because that's how you avoid blame. All right. Well, then that's it. I will follow up from there on class on Tuesday, and maybe follow. Oh, if you have any questions, let me know. And otherwise, I'm signing off here from Harvey Bunker here deep in Fort Worth, Texas.